Bhimbetka caves in the central Indian state of Madhya Pradesh are now generally recognized as one of the oldest habitats of prehistoric man on the Indian subcontinent. Surrounded by dense tropical forests full of wildlife, these caves provided a natural protection to the hunter-gatherer man from carnivorous animals and from the elements of nature. Evidence of the presence of man in these rock shelters has been traced back to the Upper Paleolithic period. The last continuous habitation in these cave shelters was as recent as 1,000 years ago. One of the important records of his presence left behind by early man in these caves is in the form of paintings or rock art. In fact, the significance of Bhimbetka as a rock art site is comparable to the well-known rock art sites of Europe, such as Lascaux and Altamira. The paintings on the walls of these caves cover a period of about 13,000 years, from about 12,000 BC to 1000 AD. The rock art of Bhimbetka and several other rock sites in India also marks the origin of the Indian painting. Why did the prehistoric man paint? Was this an attempt to communicate through a visual language when the language of words had not adequately developed? Had this something to do with magic, religion, or shamanism? Or do these paintings represent the early efforts of human beings to express an innate urge for creativity? Different scholars hold different views, but it is beyond doubt that the rock art of Bhimbetka, quite often painted in several layers by different generations, reflects the progressive stages of human evolution, from the hunter-gatherer stage to the agro-pastoral society. Therefore, the impulse behind these paintings would have also changed according to early man's own evolution. As the motives to paint became more sophisticated, so did the context and the form of paintings. While the paintings of the earlier period depict animals, like elephants and wild boar, in a naturalistic form, later the scenes become more complex and the forms more stylized. Bhimbetka caves contain more than 1,300 paintings and represent one of the largest rock painting treasures of the world. The pictorial and the plastic art traditions of India reveal strange threads of continuity, despite enormous socio-economic changes over the last 5,000 years. These specimens of the contemporary tribal arts of India, housed in the Bharat Bhavan in Bhopal, have an important affinity with the paintings of Bhimbetka. The affinity lies in the quality of the vision in which the magical religious objectives of art unite with the decorative and even the functional. Of course, compared to the creators of Bhimbetka art, both the technology and the sense of aesthetic of the agro-pastoral tribal communities had become more complex. For example, the local people of the Bastar district in Madhya Pradesh have a very old and sophisticated tradition of brass metal sculpture, which is both secular and ritualistic in nature. This image of the local goddess Telangini indicates that in the millennium following Bhimbetka, along with advances in metallurgy, the indigenous people had also evolved their own mythology. And yet the forms of horses in this painting from Bastar have a striking correspondence with the horses depicted in Bhimbetka. Unlike contemporary urban life, where the myths have an uneasy coexistence with the ordinary secular life, For the tribal communities, myths are a part of the ritual of daily living. In this relief of Ganesha, the god of wisdom, Ganesha is depicted as a part of the larger landscape of the agro-pastoral life. Similarly, the serpent god Sheshnag, who according to a myth holds the earth on its head, becomes the source of all forests, trees and plants in this colorful painting. Incidentally, several modern Indian painters also use mythology as one of their sources to express a contemporary vision. For example, Manjeet Bawa, a distinguished Delhi-based painter, uses the mythological characters of Krishna and Radha to convey the yearning for love and compassion in our society, which is full of violence. In fact, Manjeet deliberately transforms the figures of Krishna and Radha into the images of folklore lovers Heer and Raja to create a more secular environment. His treatment of human and animal figures shows the influence of tribal art, which gives them a timeless quality. India still has a live tradition of tribal art because the process of development has not yet obliterated the distinct cultural identities of the indigenous people. At the same time, they are no longer cut off from the process of change. A continuing effort is therefore being made to preserve tribal art in institutions like the Bharat Bhavan and the Museum of Man, both situated in Bhopal. In the vast Indian subcontinent, several civilizations have grown in parallel time. While the primitive man was still decorating the caves of Bhimbetka with his creative expressions, a sophisticated urban civilization, now known as the Indus Valley Civilization, had begun to grow in the northwestern plains of the Indian subcontinent. The origins of the Indus Valley Civilization go back to about 3000 BC. But its urban phase reached its maturity around 2500 BC. The archaeological evidence found in the forms of terracotta seals, toys, and the remains of planned cities indicate that the people of this civilization were highly evolved, both technologically as well as artistically. Much of the evidence of the painting activity of this period has been erased by time. But the abstract geometric designs on these large pots show that abstraction and stylization had become integral elements of Indus Valley art. The stylization of the human figure reaches a stark simplicity in these figurines of the dancing girl and the mother goddess. The decorative elements, which were to become so much a part of the classical Indian sculpture and painting in the later period, have been generously utilized in this bearded figure, who was perhaps a priest. The next major phase of Indian art was inspired by Buddhism, which became a major cultural influence in India from the 5th century BC onwards. This stupa at Sanchi in Madhya Pradesh was constructed by Emperor Ashoka of the Mauryan dynasty in the 3rd century BC and is now a World Heritage Site. He had proclaimed Buddhism as the official religion of the state after he saw the bloodbath of the Kalinga War. Several successive generations of kings have added to the Sanchi Stupa complex right up to the 12th century AD. At one time, this complex housed a Buddhist monastery and a training institution for the young Buddhist monks. Here again, there is little or no surviving evidence of painting, but advances in the field of architecture, represented by Sanchi, and the excellence of sculptural friezes on its 4 gates is a clear evidence of the fact that the art of drawing and painting must have also reached a high level of maturity during this period. The sculptural reliefs on the 4 gateways, or toranas surrounding the main stupa, relate the stories of the previous lives of Buddha, or the Jataka tales. These represent some of the finest examples of early Buddhist art. About 400 kilometers south of Sanchi, in the present state of Maharashtra, the Buddhist monks were to create the second major surviving landmark in the history of Indian painting. This landmark is represented by the world-famous murals in Ajanta caves. The caves at Ajanta were painstakingly dug out by the Buddhist monks as a retreat. These caves were carved out from about the 2nd century BC to the 7th century AD and have now been declared a World Heritage Site. On the walls of these caves, the Buddhist monks have painted Jataka tales as their predecessors had related similar stories through sculptural friezes at Sanchi. These paintings were inspired by the idea of attaining nirvana through meditation, an idea which is central to Buddhism. The mural paintings of Ajanta established for the first time some of the important features of classical Indian painting, which were to frequently reoccur in the later periods. These include the architectonic nature of the mural, flat perspective, lyrical idealization of the human figure, incorporation of nature as an essential element within the landscape of human activity, and the representation of the size of the human figure by its importance rather than by its location in the group. The Ajanta phase of the Indian painting came to an end by about the 7th century AD, but the involvement of Buddhist monks with art continued right through the medieval ages. Buddhism spread to other parts of India, such as Ladakh, and to other parts of the world, such as Tibet, China, South Asia, and the Far East. In the process, the Buddhist iconography and art became one of the most important parts of the world heritage. The Thiksem monastery in Ladakh, dating back to the 15th century AD, houses several examples of medieval Indian Buddhist art. The tradition of wall painting in particular, which had attained classical stature in Ajanta, continued in the temples of southern India. For example, the walls of this Pandavat temple at Kottayam in Kerala, dating back to the 17th century, are still covered by paintings of a mythological nature. The tradition of painting on the walls also exists in several other parts of rural India. In the Madhubani region of Bihar, women paint the kovar, or the room of the newlyweds, with the images of Lord Rama and his wife Sita. This is a way of idealizing the husband and wife relationship. Similarly, the Rathwa tribals of Madhya Pradesh still paint the walls of their homes with mythological figures and intricate designs on special occasions. Obviously, some symbols of the urban intrusion into the tribal world, like guns and watches, have entered into the imagery of the Rathwas. Following the period of Ajanta, for about 200 years, there is very little record of the painting activity in India. Yet, this is the period in which the Jain religion was growing as an important cultural influence in Western India, and which found expression in the form of great temples. Although Jainism developed around the same time as Buddhism, it was only between the 10th and the 13th centuries AD that it acquired a dominant political position in large parts of Western India. The Jain kings, their ministers and merchants were enlightened men who were great builders and who also set up libraries of religious and secular texts. The texts were usually on palm leaves and carried elaborate illustrations. These illustrations became the genesis of the art of miniature painting. The Jain miniatures follow the flat perspective of Ajanta, but their treatment of the human figure and face is different from the murals of Ajanta. Generally, one eye is finished with a long tail, and the other eye often projects beyond the facial outline. When the Mughals arrived in India in 1526, there was therefore already a large body of Indian painters who had been painting for generations. Akbar, the great Mughal emperor, who was not literate but was very keen on learning, set up karkhanas or ateliers at Fatehpur Sikri near Agra to illustrate epics like the Hamza-Nama. Hamza-Nama, or Dastan-e-Amir Hamza, is the story of the exploits of an uncle of the Prophet Muhammad. About 1100 episodes of the story were illustrated on cloth pieces, each of 2 feet by 2.5 feet. The work took 15 years and was done under the supervision of 2 Persian master painters, Mir Sayyid Ali and Abdus Samad. And a lot of Indian painters were also involved to complete different aspects of the paintings. This created a new synthesis of several traditions in the Indian painting.
The Persian tradition which the 2 artists brought. The painters of India, who came from different parts of India, brought the Rajasthani tradition, Gujarati tradition, perhaps a Lahori tradition. And then Akbar was presented with a copy of a polyglot Bible, Plantain's very famous polyglot, which had illustration, a European illustration. And he bade his artists to use, learn from this. So European tradition in that sense.
Ghulam Muhammad Sheikh, a distinguished painter who taught art history at the MS University Baroda, frankly acknowledges his debt to Hamza-Nama. He constantly uses a variety of Indian traditional sources along with sources like Simone Martini and Ambrogio Lorenzetti from Italy to express his own contemporary vision. To return to the Mughal painting, the tradition of illustrating literary classics and folklore tales started by Akbar was continued by his successors Jahangir and Shah Jahan, but not on the scale of Hamza-Nama. Instead, Akbar's successors encouraged the miniature format, which meant a book-size painting that could be held in the hand. The paintings done in the later Mughal courts came to be known as the Mughal miniatures. The Mughal miniatures show a fantastic naturalism of color and depict birds and beasts in exquisite detail. Some of these miniatures were carried by Thomas Rowe to England and were also seen by Rembrandt. Rembrandt was deeply impressed by the attention to detail and by the vibrant colors of Mughal miniatures. Most of the Rajput kings of Rajasthan had a close political and cultural association with the Mughals. This was also true of the kings of Udaipur or Mewar, Kota, Bundi, Jodhpur and Kishangarh. As is well known, Aurangzeb, the last important emperor of the Mughal dynasty, did not have any interest in the arts. Therefore, in the later part of the 17th century, the artists working at the Mughal court migrated to the Rajput courts of Rajasthan and the hill kingdoms of northern India. Rajasthan already had the tradition of miniatures in the form of Jain book illustrations. But Rajasthani miniatures really blossomed only in the 17th and 18th centuries after the migration of the artists from the Mughal court. Several schools of miniature painting grew in Rajasthan, each identified with a specific kingdom, such as Udaipur, Kota, Bundi, Jodhpur, and Kishangarh. Some themes in Rajasthani miniatures were common in almost all schools, such as the Radha Krishna legend, the Baramasa, or the cycle of the seasons, and the Ragmala, that is paintings inspired by the specific moods of Indian classical ragas. But there were important differences in themes and variations of style due to local influences and the taste of the patrons, which gave to different schools their special identity. For example, Udaipur or Mewar miniatures show a greater influence of Mughal miniatures because a large body of work in Mewar was done under the direct supervision of Sahibdeen, a renowned Mughal miniaturist. The Kota miniatures delight in depicting hunting scenes. The miniatures of Bundi, which is hardly 40 kilometers from Kota, excel in ornamentation of great delicacy. Some scholars are of the view that this is because of the fact that some artists trained by Sahibdeen had moved from Udaipur to Bundi. The last and perhaps the finest blossoming of the Rajasthani miniatures, also known as Rajput miniatures, occurred in the 18th century in a little kingdom called Kishangarh, about 80 kilometers from Jaipur. The Kishangarh miniatures are actually the celebration of a real love story, the love of the poet king Raja Savant Singh for a maid whom he called Bani Thani, or the Beautiful. Of course, according to the convention of the time, Bani Thani was transformed into Radha and the king Savant Singh into the divine lover Krishna. Much before Edward VIII, Raja Savant Singh ultimately abdicated the throne for his beloved. It was Nihal Chand, the master painter who had migrated from the Mughal court, who created this transformation. Of course, there were other painters like Bhavani Das and Surat Ram, who contributed to the Kishangarh school, a school distinguished by the use of gold dust, brilliant colors, and extremely light, almost weightless figures. It is because of the artistic excellence of the Rajasthani or Rajput miniatures that the renowned art scholar Anand K. Kumaraswamy wrote that the works of the Rajput painters deserve to be given an honorable place amongst the great arts of the world. From the late 17th century onward, in parallel time with the Rajasthani miniatures, several schools of miniature painting also grew in the sub-Himalayan kingdoms of northern India. Just like Rajasthan, here also, different schools in this region are identified with the names of kingdoms where they flourished, such as Kangra, Guler, Jammu, and Basholi. These are collectively called Pahari miniatures, or the miniatures of the hills. One of the most significant Pahari miniature schools is Basholi, which flourished during the late 17th and the 18th centuries. In Basholi miniatures, the lines and contours of the human figure and of the landscape are sharply etched against an uncluttered background. The Basholi school is also known for its unusual and highly imaginative color combinations, such as lime green and a luminescent yellow, which derive from folk art. These color combinations are sometimes used to create unusual moods which are not usually associated with the chosen colors. The traditions of tribal art, wall paintings of Ajanta, Mughal, Rajasthani and Pahari miniatures have been continuous sources of inspiration for several important contemporary Indian painters. For example, J. Swaminathan, who died in 1994, was deeply inspired by the tribal arts on the one hand and the Pahari miniatures on the other. Of course, neither the language nor the painterly concerns of Swaminathan were confined to these sources. Instead, along with other sources and techniques, Swaminathan uses the colors of the miniature and a combination of lace-like details and floating forms in wide open spaces to create new imagery. Similarly, Amitava Das, a Delhi-based painter, uses the colors of Basholi miniatures to create around his existentialist forms a haunting isolation. In all cultures, traditions take generations to establish roots and to grow. A contemporary artist has no obligation to follow in the footsteps of any specific tradition because his world is different and he is responding to a reality which did not exist when these traditions were established. And yet, as in other parts of the world, artists in contemporary India still refer to these traditions as a meaningful source, while at the same time evolving their own personal language.